Garry Peterson. He's a professor in environmental sciences at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and he has a special interest in resilience of social ecological systems. And he was the coordinating lead author for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and he's also an editor for Ecology and Society. And also Garry has a great interest in the next generations of scientists, and he's helping out developing the research school at the Stockholm Resilience Center and also tutoring a lot of students. Garry.
All right, great. All right, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to try and give a sustainability science perspective that ties together both the morning session with what we just had in the last two talks. And what I'm going to talk about is this human development side of the Anthropocene, and I think what we want to have is we're in the Anthropocene, and it could be horrific, or it could be good, but how can it be good? So this picture is at least one of the ways you can think about how, in some ways, an Anthropocene could be good. It's from Earl Ellis, and it's showing the time over which ecosystems around the world have been dominated by people. And if you look around in the dark brown, you see that many parts of the world in which civilization has developed have had people living and thriving in human-dominated ecosystems for a long time. So living within a social ecological system or within a social ecological planet doesn't mean it has to be degraded and bad for people or for nature. But how can we create a good Anthropocene? And I see this is really a challenge. You know, in creating the Anthropocene, we now have this huge success of the human enterprise, and that there's over 7 billion people living on Earth. But, however, 1/8 of them don't have enough to eat or have poor diets. And to have this success, humanity has massively, as Will talked about in detail, transformed the Earth. And this has been primarily during the last 50 years. And so we really have strong reasons to be concerned that this just can't continue. And especially as Johan talked about, this is pushing the Earth into a novel, unknown state where we can expect the unexpected to happen, and it's likely that a lot of these things are going to be bad because we've developed a whole society and infrastructure, both social and physical and ecological, that work in a different world. So what about the Anthropocene? So how is the Anthropocene thought about in sort of popular fiction? Right now I think it's mostly negative. But these are sort of some examples of ways of thinking about the Anthropocene. You're probably more familiar with the negative ones, of, say, the example of The Road, where basically everything collapses and the struggle of humanity is just for survival. The Economist put on their cover this sort of bricolage, muddling through version of the Anthropocene, which, as you can see, doesn't include much life. And then there's from novels, that there's these sort of ideas about a more positive vision of people and nature being together, from like sort of the classic, which probably people at least indirectly heard about, of Ecotopia, which is an early vision for a sustainable society, to more science fiction ideas about people transforming the Earth and really managing a global Earth for human and nature benefits. So these are some different visions. These more negative ones are the ones that you see in TV shows, video games, in novels today. I just see Hunger Games, for example. But what we need is we need to kind of have these more positive visions that are broadly shared and co-created by people around the world so we can achieve this good Anthropocene. And I think part of this is to think about, well, what are some of the criteria for thinking about good Anthropocene? And I think this really aligns with what Melissa was saying about Future Earth, not surprisingly, because this comes from sort of long-time discussions about sustainability. That sustainable development is really focused on saying, well, there's 3 things we need for a sustainable society. We need to think about the economy, about society, and the environment. And I'll kind of go through this talk with a little bit my version of these things, which I think is reasonable, but is my version. And so I think about society, I think one of the things that's often not so much addressed in thinking about the Anthropocene is fairness. And it's the world we live in today is radically unfair. And I think a good way of thinking about fairness is where you're born or who your parents are don't totally determine your life chances, that you have actually a fair degree of agency to have your life turn out the way you want it to be. To be prosperous, to have these chances, to have a diversity of things that you can do. And sustainable, a civilization that actually is enhancing the biosphere rather than degrading it. So if we think about our Anthropocene, we're living in the Anthropocene today, how is it doing? I'm not going to talk so much about the environmental aspect because we've had that all this morning, but I'm going to more focus on the prosperous and fair. So just example, I think one of the clear ways we're non-sustainable is extinction of biodiversity. This is the figure from the Millennium Assessment that tried to assess extinctions. The purple figures are showing the pre-human historic rates of extinction. It's a logarithmic scale. The recent past has been about 100 times more extinctions, so already very non-sustainable. And the future is expected to be something like 1,000 to 10,000 times more this historic rate. Of course, that doesn't have to happen, but we're already very non-sustainable. So how are we doing in terms of prosperity and fairness? As I mentioned already, we are incredibly prosperous in terms of the human past. And if you look at prosperity of including both health and well-being, say in the Human Development Index, which combines with income, looking at the 10 biggest countries in the world, most populous, see there's been this consistent rise in human well-being all over the world. That people, and this is especially due to increases in lifespan and education. And there's been really big reductions in poverty. But these are especially in East Asia, especially in China. And there's been really stagnation in poverty in many other parts of the world. So it's sort of a bit more of a mixed message in this. But then we come to inequality, thinking about the Gini coefficient, which I won't get into, but it's a measure of how unequal things are. And low is good, and high is bad. You can see here's a few examples. Sweden is one of the very low inequality rich countries. The US, much more unequal. Brazil, much, much more unequal, but improving. And the world, much more unequal. So the world is much more unequal than the most unequal countries in the world. So maybe South Africa best describes the world. And as many people have talked about, in South Africa you had homelands in the apartheid area where people couldn't travel, and that's basically the world we have today. You know, poor people can't come to rich countries to work. They're stopped at the border, and increasingly there's walls around the borders of countries. And another thing that's happened since 1850 is the world has really been transformed from something in which there is this kind of global segregation from one in which there's local segregation. World Bank economist who really studies inequality a lot is Branko Milankovic, and he's talked about how we've moved from a Marxist world to a post-Marxist world. So 1870s, when Marx was writing, where you lived determined about 1/3 of your income opportunities, and your class determined the rest. And that's flipped around today. So we have more inequality, and it's much more shaped by where you're born. And a more clear way of thinking about this is looking at the income distributions in countries and comparing them to the global income distribution. So this is the percentages of people's incomes in countries, the top 1%, the bottom 25%, and this is the entire world on the right. So what you see here is the very richest people in many African countries, the top 10%, the top 5%, the top 20%, are all poorer than the bottom 5% in Denmark. So what this means is there's these huge differences between countries that if you're in this top 5%, you can do much better by moving in terms of income, and only in income. But this is related to many things. So there's this big difference to me. You can do much better by migrating. But that's being stopped. And so one of the other ways in which inequality is changing, there is changes in global inequality if you look at an individual level. But these are very, very small. If you remember that graph, there's some tiny little things going down. This is a graph that's showing the same type of change, of showing what's happened to different deciles of the world income distribution over the last 20 years. And what you can see is there's been this actually, what you could say, pro-poor growth, of that poor people have had positive growth, and they've had more growth than some of the rich people. But this has been mostly at sort of the middle income people, and of course the very rich. But this has also been very much located within China. So there is a decrease in global poverty, but not so much at the extreme end, more at the middle, and it's very much located in China. And the sort of global, more middle rich people have actually not done very well in the last 20 years. And the very, very rich have done very well. So we have a kind of a complex picture of world inequality. And so there's kind of three ways, the main ways that people have tried to reduce this inequality, or they themselves. Is one is having this pro-poor growth, which is said China's had, but not too much where else. There's aid and redistribution, but this is basically incredibly, incredibly tiny. So there's about $100 billion of aid in the world. And of course, this isn't all actually helping human well-being. It's also paying for consultants in rich countries and buying weapons and stuff like that. It's about 0.1% of the gross world product. And if you think of rich countries, if we were thinking about the world being a whole, rich countries spend about 20% of their income on providing social services. So not government spending, but on providing social services. So that's much, much higher than what you have in the gross world product. And the other thing that happens, which I've talked about as being kind of largely blocked to rich countries, is migration from poor countries. And this is quite small as well, about 10 million people a year, about the same percentage as the gross world product, 0.1%. But this remittance flows are still about 4 times larger than aid. But if you think 4 times bigger, that's 0.4%. So very unequal. So why I bring this up, I think that this is sort of giving some numbers on what Melissa talked about, that if we're kind of trying to think about what a good Anthropocene is, we need to think about this side of the coin as well. And these parts of sustainable development are all linked together. I'd say these interactions between prosperity and fairness are uncertain, between fairness and sustainability and fairness are uncertain, but they're generally, I think the balance of evidence is that they're positive. And sustainability underpins prosperity, but our current prosperity is undercutting sustainability. And just give one example of this. This is sort of maybe not solid, but it's a good estimate of stuff. This is from the UN Human Development Report, looking at the attempts to reduce poverty. This is what they forecast with sort of business as usual. And this is how much they think things could be improved or poverty reduced with a very aggressive strategy. This is how much poverty is estimated to increase if you have actually some bad climate outcomes, showing that the attempts to reduce poverty can be overwhelmed by environmental unsustainability. Whether that curve is exactly not or correct or not, it shows there's actually really huge risks. So I think thinking about the Anthropocene really challenges our social and political thinking, not just our environmental thinking. Requiring a good Anthropocene requires that we have new types of global social integration that embrace diversity, that have a lot of ways of participating in the global planet, that actually think about how this diversity can support the biosphere and builds a more inclusive type of wealth that actually enhances human well-being. Secondly, I think that we know that this 21st century will likely not just be ecologically surprising, but socially surprising. You can just reflect on the 20th century and say we're pushing things even harder. There's likely to be new communities forming in different places through new diaspora, new types of social identities, new social movements, and new types of economies. And if we're going to think about the Anthropocene, we should be thinking about preparing for these types of surprises. So I'm just going to finish up with one thing. So one of the things I've been working with my colleagues at the Bay Area and at the Stockholm Resilience Center is trying to take some of this sort of linked up thinking of saying, well, a lot of analyses of these global environmental problems is really done in silos, and different types of strategies for addressing these problems aren't sort of linking up together. So here we kind of looked, I'm not going to explain this, about a whole bunch of different environmental problems, from invasive species, persistent organic pollutants, global pandemics, and looked at solutions that have been proposed a lot of broad range of disciplines, from the ecological, political, economic sciences, of these build social capital to enhance good governments, to do more science. And what these two figures are showing is that there's a lot of resonance between that there's multiple solutions for these problems, and a lot of these different solutions intersect as well to address multiple problems. So while these problems can kind of reinforce each other, there's a lot of potential with linked up thinking to do much better with the solutions. And this requires integrating across disciplines. And also, I think there's a lot of potential to work across problem domains, both like Elizabeth was talking about, of looking for these co-benefits. The challenge is doing this, and I'm going to skip this. I think there's a lot of capacity to do better. But I think to do this, we need to kind of think, if we accept these are criteria for the Anthropocene, to deal with surprise, I think we need to kind of think about how to do these in a resilient way, because if we don't do them in a resilient way, they're not going to work. And resilience means we have to expect surprise and maintain diversity and alternate ways of approaching things, because we don't know how to do it best, and enable self-organization, which means this co-design that Melissa talked about. And just to finally say, I think to go back to this visions of the future, we need to try and think about articulating attractive, fun visions of the Anthropocene that are not the Hunger Games, that are not the road, that can actually motivate people to invest their time, their energy, their passion, as well as their pension funds in creating a good Anthropocene rather than one that is not a place we want to live. Thanks very much.